I talk so much about childhood trauma, and yet, as I have reflected and shared here in so many videos, a lot of the trauma that happened to me came in my adult life in different ways than in my childhood. And I've been doing a lot of research as I've been talking about to build this course. And so I've really been diving into trauma, childhood wounds, all of the things that impact our lives. And it really hit me that I would say the hardest parts of my adult life have been defined by single event traumas, so PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, one-time events, and a series of complex relational traumas, both in my marriage and divorce, with my mother primarily. Like those are the biggest relationships. And then with my kids, right, from the trauma they've been through, their own stories, medical traumas, relational traumas, mental health challenges, like all of that stuff sits on my heart in a way that is so much more profound in some ways than my childhood trauma. And that made me want to share this video with you, which is, what does it look like when you are living in, oftentimes, this trauma world, but you don't know it? Your trauma personality has been shaped by adult traumas, things that happen to you, let's say after the age of 18-ish, right? Where maybe you lost a parent, maybe it was really devastating how that happened, or it was having a chronically emotionally unsafe parent, or a narcissistic partner or ex, dating dynamics, violence, losing really important, profound things to you, witnessing things that were traumatic, and you just think this is who you are. You just think that, okay, well, I kind of do these weird things, but you don't really know that it could be really significant, complex PTSD from your adult life. So I wanted to share what I think are 10 common signs that maybe you might want to look into therapy. I'll link some to my website. I have many books listed on complex trauma and trauma. Don't forget that trauma lives in the body and in your mind, right? In your story, in your relationships. It can come at you. You can be having the most lovely day, and something that reminds you or is connected to the trauma, like let's say an ex, and then you have a custody thing, or you have parent trauma and now it's the parent's birthday, and what do? Or you have to visit them, and it activates so many wounds. And so many of us, we know, already have childhood trauma. And so on top of this foundation of childhood trauma can be these really significant events. And before I share the last part, which is the list, I want to say that for me, for example, and I've shared this, that I just realized this in the last few years. I set up my marriage, the life I was going to have, the mommy I was going to be. I used to joke, like I've said, driving the Cadillac or the minivan with the nails and picking up the kids, because I grew up with a single mom, no family, in daycare. And I'm not challenging any of that. We all do what we can. But for me, I really wanted to be, the fantasy was, I was going to give my kids the thing I didn't have, a normal, stable, healthy marriage. And up until 8 years, almost 10 together, I thought I had that. And while I may share it someday, there was a catastrophic event that happened at that point, which then kicked off a bunch of other catastrophic events that I found myself divorced and raising with full custody, almost four children with almost full custody, and then full custody for the last, 7 years at least. But it was 80% on paper, and it was about 90 in reality. And my daughter was 1, and my oldest child was 9. And that has been what has rocked me, even with all the things I've been through, from, being a victim of violence, to my father taking his own self out of this world at 23, to the really significant ongoing trauma with my mom. And then the other thing was witnessing and being with my daughter through a lot of medical trauma. I mean, 3 years old, we're in the hospital for 7 days, 8 days. 12 years old, we're in the hospital for 11 days. It's been over a month total of hospitalizations. And so all of that, we just kind of keep going as adults, right? It's like, and in some ways, I think we neglect that trauma. We over-focus on what happened in childhood, which of course is kind of how I also believe we need to look at. But I think sometimes we don't realize that we're still suffering a lot from the things that happened. And because I had attached my entire healing of my childhood unconsciously to my marriage and to the kind of children and life they were going to have, when all of that shattered and then frankly continued to be challenging for many, 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 many years, it rocked me to my core, but I was so busy raising kids, I didn't really have time to deal with the trauma. And so there's a lot of it, right? So that's where this, just to give you some feedback, that's where this comes from. That's where this comes from. So let's talk about the 10 signs, okay? Number 1, you often can have a loss of belief in faith, in religion, in systems, in institutions, in interests, things that you once held sacred, you just no longer believe in, you don't care about, and you just have nothing to hold on to. There's a vacancy there. And this can happen for many reasons around certain things like religion, not just from trauma. But the point is, you had something you held as a way to connect and not feel so alone or to lose yourself in. And for some reason, whatever reason, you no longer have that. So there's just like this shallow emptiness inside where you don't have anywhere to put that now, but you don't know what to do with it. Number 2, chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. So all of the time, you live in a state often of that fight or flight being in the on position, and you cannot turn it off. You might wake up and have anxiety. You might feel like you're just going through your day and you have it. And then that hypervigilance piece makes you overread, overinterpret, like always scanning for threat. And what I found is that unless we are dissociating, binge watching, video game playing, using substances, doing something, losing ourselves in a book or special interest, or deeply distracted, that is the often only time we feel like we are not in that hyperactive activation state of our nervous system. Number 3, and you think, oh, I just have anxiety, oh, work is stressful, but yes, but underlying that, it's like you're always elevated in that regard. Number 3, sudden mood shifts, sadness, anger, and on some level you think, oh, it's just everyone gets sad. That's so true. We all have high highs and low lows in life, but a lot of this is actually emotional flashbacks to states in the trauma in your adult life. So not just regressions back to childhood, but regressions back to childhood potentially, and they also connect like tissue to your adult traumas, like I was saying about the childhood wound and the marriage, right? And how those are all connected. And that childhood wound got activated every time I felt like my kids were suffering because of my divorce. Every time I witnessed the things that they've had to go through, it would always come back to, well, that's my fault. Right? I picked this person, these things happened, and it's all my fault. And a lot of things have to be because I'm the adult, but even my kids have said, Mom, you can't own all that. So I've had to work on that. But my point is, before I did the work, it was so deep in there because it was triggering all those things, but I wouldn't always know it. Or I could watch a movie or watch a TikTok, right? And it can transfer you back to childhood or to your adult trauma, and they can link up. The next thing is passive. I'm going to say this in a certain way because of this platform. Passive, I don't want to be here anymore type of thinking, where you have no intention to do anything, but there's a part of you that just feels like if it wouldn't hurt everyone, I wouldn't care, right? It's so much pain to carry. It's so hard. And you don't really know it. It looks like the energy of your life, the flicker of the flame inside is just really barely there. And it can go up and down, but the point is there's just this lifelessness around being here. Number 5, isolating, as I've said in many, many cases, you tend to want to be alone because it's really about your nervous system only feeling like, all right, I don't have to be on and reading and detecting and meeting needs when I'm with other people. And you might think it's social anxiety, that you have a fear of rejection and people. And of course, as I've been learning more and more about our brains and our nervous systems, absolutely that could be the case. But it can also be that you're so wiped out from that stress response that you have been activated in that stress response really significantly, not only since childhood, but since this adult trauma or series of traumas, that you only know how to really down regulate when you're alone. The next one is compulsive caretaking. So oftentimes this was wired into your childhood, very common in both anxious and disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment patterns, where your job was to rotate around the parent in some way to fulfill needs between enmeshment, parentification, whatever it was that outside in orientation. So we look to others first to meet their needs, to read their mood, their mind, and then we determine that we're okay. And we can get a sense of self from you're the best mom ever, right? You're the best dad, you're the best parent, you're the best partner, but it's a very one-way dynamic. And that is depleting, but that's also a way to minimize and distract from the adult trauma. It might be an over response from the trauma, you lost someone, you feel like you weren't there, so now you're going to always be there, things like that. The next one, connected to that, the opposite as a result of this, is chronic self-neglect. And so you neglect doctor's appointments and dentist appointments. I've talked about this before, but you're so outward focused, but when it really comes to you, you don't really take care of yourself. And you put things off, and then they often become bigger because you didn't deal with them. But the idea is it's deeply rooted in oftentimes some part of this adult trauma around disregard, shame, feeling like it's your fault. Like I said, the big problem with these adult traumas is we think, well, I was an adult, I should have known better. Why did I do that? It's we're all still growing these little child parts of ourselves inside. You don't wake up one day and know everything. Our whole lives are evolutions of knowledge. And so, but there can be a lot of disregard in that, or minimizing or avoiding or blaming. And so that makes you feel like, well, I'm not entitled to live in my trauma for that because I did that, right? I used to say, just as an aside, I used to say to my mom, who married my stepdad within 3 months and he had no job and no car, I would say to her, well, you married him, before I got married. I knew it all, and my mom had a lot of issues, but she would always say yeah, well, you think you know everything, and she wasn't wrong. And then as I look back and I'm like, girl, you had a master's degree when you made these choices, in psychology, what do you mean? And yes, some things changed. They did change. But it's so easy to sit there and act well, I've got it all figured out, right? Of course, that's part of being younger. I was in my 20s. I thought I had it all figured out. Turns out I did not. So, but the point is that you just don't necessarily understand that that's all connected. And then the last two things are, as a result of those, often chronic health issues that are often tied to that ACEs, that adverse childhood experiences, that stress response that you probably already had in childhood. And now you've had it in your adult life too. So your nervous system is burned out, your chronic health issues from self-neglect. There can be a lot of fatigue, you just don't feel well in your body for many different reasons. And that can be related to trauma. And then lastly, there's an avoidance of any trauma reminders. And I always say my example of this is when I found out about my dad, I was 23 years old. We were literally in the process of moving from Texas to California. We were in a hotel room. And all of our things were coming on a truck, me and my mom. This is the years where it was the few years it was really decent, just the two of us. And we got the phone call about my dad. And it was Father's Day weekend. So you can imagine how Father's Day is for me every year. But, and it's been now it's been 30 something years, right? My daughter's texting me. And so the point is, San Diego was where I was, a certain part of San Diego. And then I was living in San Diego when I had that catastrophic event in my marriage. And I lived there for about 6 years. And I had lived there also in my 20s. And so I love San Diego, and I only live an hour away. But every time I go there, even though now it's not like it was even 7 or 8 years ago, 10 years ago, I still feel this thing one of my kids said, oh, well, could you even come live there if I decide to go there after college? I'm like, I don't know, because that place holds still so much trauma. And I think I could now. I couldn't have years ago. I would do it now to be close to kids if I wanted to, or they were there, right? But the point is that we find ourselves avoiding places, restaurants, jobs, opportunities, experiences, because inside they hold so much trauma memory. And even though we think we've worked through it and past it, it still is affecting our lives. And sometimes it can affect our lives in ways that could hold us back from things that we need to work through or things we want to try or experience, right? And so all of that can be deeply, deeply impactful to our lives, and yet we don't know it. And I think that's the heart of the thing we don't talk about. There are many ways to have complex PTSD, not just from your parents, right? There's a lot of things that relate to people's stories and experiences. But I really do think that some of us just have better luck than others. I've noticed there are some of us that just have more bad luck. I have clients that say, why is this happening to me? I'm like, I don't know, but I get it, and so they are impacting our lives though. And they are worthy of getting therapy, support, treatment, podcasts, videos. Like, don't neglect that just because you have gotten used to living with it. Just because you've normalized it, you think it's part of your personality, as I say, your trauma personality. And really it's about your wounds that are maybe affecting your life in ways you're not aware of. So I'll link some to my website. I have just a bunch of book recommendations down there for family systems and complex trauma. There are books on actual trauma in your body and things like that. Somatic therapies help work on the body trauma, nervous system, polyvagal theory, those can be helpful. Certainly relational type therapies around your family system. Obviously, if you had a really toxic marriage or divorce, or you're still in one, there's so many resources now for those things, but just know that you're worthy of getting support and love. As I've laughed with my therapist, I'm like, we're talking about this again. I'm so sorry. Something happened now that triggered that. And I'm not necessarily living in that anymore, but it's still got some emotional and energy there, and I need to deal with it. So I just think we're always evolving and growing through these issues. And I hope that you found this video helpful. I will see you soon. Please take good care and stay safe.